Welcome to the Adaptivity podcast. My name is Alexei Kravitsky and I'm your host. In this podcast series, we're going to meet thought leaders and practitioners from the field to learn more about adaptivity. And then we're going to go deep into specific practices that you can use in your organization, in your department, in your team to strive for a state of higher adaptivity. Stay with us. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Adaptivity podcast. And today with me is Ahmad Fahmy. Hi, Ahmad.
Hey, how are you?
And as we spoke before, you said you really like the name. What is adaptivity for you?
It's the idea of an organization being able to switch direction, and that cost of switching is very low. So
Okay.
you can switch direction, and it's not going to be incredibly painful. And I can demonstrate that with a story. I was talking to someone recently, and they realized, for example, there's a huge opportunity for their company in the Qatar World Cup. And they were able to switch directions within three weeks before the World Cup to actually send multiple teams there and do some amazing work. And the transaction cost of switching direction wasn't incredibly painful. And so
Okay.
that story and that definition is what adaptive means to me.
Do you feel that every organization needs to be adaptive?
That's such a great question because it goes to context.
Mm.
And many will say yes, and I will say again, I mean, it depends on the context. So, for example, in a bank, does it need to be adaptive? Yes and no. The back office of a bank, for example, that's uh, producing feeds to the general ledger and treasury systems and KYC systems and things like that, does it need to be incredibly adaptive? No, I think they'll be optimizing for something different. The front office of a bank, it needs to be incredibly adaptive, responding to things like cryptocurrencies and new asset classes and new ideas and new algorithms and emerging markets and that kind of stuff, and they are very adaptive. You'll see that the front office of, for example, of a bank, they'll say runs on Excel, whereas the back office runs on mainframes.
Right.
And so it's easy to say yes,
Mm-hmm.
everyone should be adaptive. I would say the classic consulting answer, it depends.
And because you've mentioned a bank, right? I'm showing your article, which you've co-authored with Craig Alarman, How to Form
Yeah.
Teams, a story of self-designing teams. And probably that was one of the earliest published experiment and pretty much successful, I believe, of letting teams self-design, self-form. It was some
Yeah.
years ago, right?
It's almost a decade ago.
And then somewhere about, I know, maybe 5 years, so maybe you would correct me. I basically encountered another great idea of yours, which is a Gemba Sprint. Going from my team self-design workshops to Gemba Sprints, like, what was your journey of discovering this as a practice? And maybe you start with like defining what a Gemba Sprint is for our audience.
Yeah. So just some background to these patterns, the way they emerge, whether it's team self-design, Gemba Sprint, the thing I'm about to publish now, um, they all emerge from actual work I'm doing, a problem I'm trying to solve. The first time we were introduced in that bank at that time was a story that Craig mentioned. He just mentioned a story in the training, and it just piqued one of the senior managers' interests. And then the question is, how exactly do you do this? Do you just put everybody in a room? Is there a pattern people can follow? And without going into too much detail, because it's quite disappointing to a lot of people how I came up with the idea. Um, in some cases, it's interesting. Other cases, disappointing. Um, necessity is the mother of invention, and so you come up with this thing, and then is it the question? It works, like it works, and then the question is, did it work because of my facilitation, or did it work because the pattern itself is useful?
Right.
And then you repeat it. It said, okay, it's working. It's kind of repeatable, and then you other coaches try it, and then other organizations try it, and you're like, okay, we have something that's repeatable, and it seems to demonstrably work, I guess, in a very non-scientific way.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And then I published a pattern. the same thing with Gemba Sprint. It followed sort of the same playbook. And
Hmm.
the fundamental problem I was trying to solve with Gemba Sprint is getting senior leaders and even managers to Gemba. It was
Okay.
just something I constantly failed at. I would tell senior leaders you should really spend time with the teams. And when I say spend time with the teams, I don't mean going and giving a skip level, or going and saying here's an offsite, not an offsite, where they go and just sort of tell
Hmm.
people what's going on, and they make a travel the world. I mean, actually work with the team, really find out what's happening. What the military calls the ground truth.
Right.
uh, Taste the food. If you were, or drink the coffee if you were the CEO of Starbucks. I just couldn't get senior leaders to do it in a real meaningful way, or again, even management. Again, this is the companies I work with. And so the Gemba Sprint was born to try to solve that problem, because what when senior leaders, it doesn't matter what you tell them, these are very busy people.
Right.
And when they install something like a framework from Six Sigma to less to, doesn't matter, they're just they've installed this new operating system,
Yeah.
good things should happen. And really what Scrum and less and a lot of these, or what they do is they give you fast feedback with how bad the, or like what are the real,
Exactly.
what's the real crap of the company, right? It's like a Ken Schwaber. I don't know if this
Mm.
is politically correct to say anymore. He said, Scrum is like your mother-in-law. It'll tell
Yeah,
you
almost can. Yeah.
everything is wrong with you. Although it's not a very popular quote anymore. That's what it does.
No,
It tells you what's wrong with you. But if you're not there to hear it, see it, taste it, then
you will
what's the
miss
point?
that. Yeah, you'll get
Yeah.
only the positive news. So I'm
Yeah.
happy that you said that you had problems with inviting managers to Gamba, because I think we all have tried and failed in some regards. So, what is your trick of doing that?
Okay. So this is the what I learned from team self-design and making
Right.
it successful. I just brought over to Gemba Sprint. and
Uh huh.
and so the reason team self-design worked
Hmm.
was, although it was completely made up based on really nothing other than things I was into at the time and movies I was really into,
Okay.
right? Right? And I'm sort of like taking the lid off of the team self-design. I was like, really liked the movie at that time, and was really into the Pomodoro technique and multiple other things.
Yeah.
And but I didn't go into the room of 70 people in London and say, "Hey, let's try something based on a movie
Okay.
that I watched." Or it was,
So, just to clarify, I'm sorry for interrupting
yeah.
your story. We'll come back to it. So, when you were about to try your team self-design workshop, you had never heard about from anyone trying that. Actually, you just made it up. What
Zero,
you're saying? Zero. Oh my God.
zero.
Oh wow.
And let me, not only was it zero, that I like, there was no paper I had or article. I know since the article was published, stuff has been written about team self design. But
Yeah, a lot of stuff has been written.
back then there was, maybe I could have done a, well, you'll understand why I didn't have plenty of time to research what to
Mm,
do, because the the, the guy who was running the department,
yeah.
a guy named Gully, really awesome leader.
Hmm.
Um, he told me I was going to facilitate it.
Hmm.
I want to say half an hour before the session.
What? Really?
Yes.
Okay.
This is half an hour before the session, or even less than that. He told me I
Hmm.
was going to facilitate it.
Oh wow.
And so it's not like I had this whole. And so, but one thing I know about being a consultant and a coach, or working in the space, if you walk into a room with an air of authority
Hmm.
and saying, we're going to do this thing,
Yeah.
people go, okay, we're going to do this thing. And so when I
Yeah.
walked into the room with all of these people, and back then nobody had heard of this idea, nobody thought it was going to work. I told them we're going to try the team self design pattern, this pattern that I'm making up. And so that's why I told you it can be disappointing to some, because there's no science behind this,
No.
you know. And just like in a sense, XP,
Hmm.
was an experience report, right? Like, Kent was making it up in Chrysler. He's cobbling things together. It worked, and it became XP, right? And this is the same idea.
And
If you're
funnily
gonna
enough,
walk,
it was a failed project at Chrysler. This C3 project was a disaster, I think, back then.
and so without getting too much team self design, I was really into Pomodoro. So
Yeah.
we know that. So what I called the iteration I set for
Hmm.
the length of a Pomodoro timer. I moved people around because there's a movie called Inside Man, which that was a really successful thing to do, to move people around and all this
Okay.
kind of stuff. And when you have 30 minutes to come up with something, you're going to really focus and deliver and come up with something interesting.
Hmm.
And but what I took from that experience into Gemba Sprint is, if you name something, if you give it a brand, people assume it's something. It's like keto, carnivore. People want to name a thing to give it something. To give it some credence. I don't know
Yeah.
what's in our. So I took that away. If you have sort of confidence
Hmm.
in the approach, and you'll say, "Hey, we're gonna try something. It's probably not gonna work." I didn't do it. I didn't do that. I just walked in and said, "Here's what we're gonna try," and we're gonna because there's already enough disbelief in the room.
Sure.
Like, I don't need to add to the disbelief, right? And then the last thing is, and this is really, really important, do I have the buy-in from a senior leader?
Hmm.
They're like, really buys into this idea, and I did. And so fast forwarding to Gemba Sprint, the problem solving is I can get senior leaders really to go to the ground floor and see the ground truth.
Right.
They want, because of the system, I don't blame anyone, I blame a system. The system that they grew up in is one that messages get filtered and filtered and translated and then sent to them and communicated on a PowerPoint.
Right.
And we all know that game,
Right.
that by the time it reaches them, everything is rosy until it's not, right?
Watermelon management or whatever you call it. Right. Yeah.
And so I had a client that had hired me to help them with an acquisition, massive acquisition that they made. And after visiting, I realized this thing is a nightmare. Like,
Hmm.
what it needs is incredibly difficult decisions to be made. There's no pretty thing to do. There's no like agile fairy dust or anything.
Right.
Actually installing Scrum immediately is going to show them, was going to create a lot of noise.
Hmm.
So I needed senior leaders there. And of course, the whenever you say, "Hey, I need you to come out to India." Now listen to the challenge. I need you to come out to India with me
Okay.
and spend a week to 2 weeks or a sprint with a team.
Hmm.
You know the answer to that. I know I'd love to, but I'm busy.
Unless there's a cool name associated to this
Yeah.
practice, which is a Gemba
Well,
Sprint. Right.
well, no. What I did was I went to the CIO of the
Okay.
parent company.
Hmm. Uh-huh.
Remember, I told you I had to get senior, and I told him the idea. I was like, "Look, here's the situation. If unless you show that it's a priority to you,
Hmm.
no one would prioritize it." And I sold him on the Gemba Sprint, and so he said, "Okay, so tell me more about the Gemba Sprint." I said, quite simply, uh, you will join a team at Gemba for a sprint. It's that simple. Of course, there's a lot of things that went into that. And I said, you asked me to. The big problem is you're not delivering enough, which
Hmm.
I know is a symptom, but it's never the problem, right? So I said, how much would you like them to deliver? He said, double would be great. Again, made up numbers, right? Double sounds good. I said, okay, for an experiment, let's double the amount of work they have to do,
Hmm.
so long as you're there doing it with them, right? You can double, but you have to be there with them. And I'm not expecting you to code, and I sort of gave him some guidelines. I'm asking you to use common vernacular, to be like an Elon Musk, ask good questions,
Yeah.
see what's really happening, observe, but you have to really be present. And he's like, you know what? And he's an enlightened, he was really, really brilliant guy. And he's like, I get it. Actually, I get it. And I need to see it. I need to pick up the rock and see what's happening underneath.
Right.
As soon as he agreed, guess how many people agreed to come to India? Just
Together
guess.
with him from the management, you mean?
From senior leadership and management, and
Well, because you're so proud, I would say a lot. I would say a dozen of people.
exactly a little bit more than a dozen
Oh,
people
wow.
flew to India and spent a sprint with the team. And I'm talking about from sprint planning to sprint review.
I would like to go a bit deeper in that because are you saying that, like, if you have a team of, I don't know, 7 people, and then now there are plus 10 managers coming from the head office to join them in a sprint. Now you have a team of what, 17 people doing a sprint together, and half of them cannot
Yeah.
really read code.
Yeah. No,
How does this
that's
work?
a great question. Again, we don't really work when, at least I don't really work in one team scrum organizations. I mean, in
Okay.
this case, it was, I think, five, I'm sorry, 15 teams plus five doing sort of
Okay, so
maintenance.
it's a large
Yeah,
scale context with
yeah,
15 teams, so
yeah,
about
yeah.
100 people. Okay.
Yeah, this one product had uh, about 200 people working on it or so.
Okay. Then I will reformulate my question. Like, what do you actually expect the managers to do for, let's say, 2 weeks with teams?
It's sort of bidirectional. Uh, Really, at the meta level,
Hmm.
I want the managers or senior leaders to really understand what's happening.
Okay.
Really, really understand what's happening
Hmm.
to the extent that they can in 2 weeks, in a way that they're never going to get from a PowerPoint presentation or the answer to the question that they might ask an agile coach: how are the teams?
Hmm.
It's almost like somebody asking, the nanny, how are the kids?
Hmm.
Well, go ask the kids yourself, or go spend some time with. Don't ask the nanny, or ask your partner how are the kids. It's the same way. Like, they really understand what's happening. That's sort of at the meta level, but also at the team level, it's inheriting and understanding some of the sense of urgency that
Hmm.
by design management and leaders have, because all the layers, much of the urgency and purpose and why, and the why question doesn't filter down to a team.
Hmm.
And so that's at the meta level.
Okay.
If you mean at the practical level,
Yeah, like what do they do on daily basis, the managers, when they are with teams? Because actually, I've
yeah,
tried to convince several times in different organizations managers to go and read about your Gemba Sprint and actually go join team and see how actually things are at their factory floor. They were really hesitant
yeah,
because they probably have been too far from the code. They can probably still read and maybe even write code, but they would not be willing to show their weaknesses, so to say, in front of the team. So, what do you expect the managers to do, and how do you not put them, to the front line so they are a little bit inconfident?
yeah. I mean, th- you know, this you mentioned this thing about managers not wanting to show vulnerability,
Right.
which in and of itself is a problem. And the way I coach managers, and I'll say it's actually quite powerful to show vulnerability, to actually go and say, look, I haven't written a constructor in 20 years, or in some cases I have never actually been a developer. Like, can you just, like, what's going on here?
Okay. Okay.
And
That's
that
powerful.
actually, that it is quite powerful. Like,
Hmm.
they think that they're being effective by not showing vulnerability. They're actually being ineffective, right?
Mm.
And
Hmm.
that's one dynamic. And another thing I'll tell is a whole preparation to the Gamba sprint. Like, okay, use this as an opportunity to refresh your memory in certain regards.
Uh-huh.
I'm not asking you to learn how to write poetry. I'm asking you to learn how to read poetry.
Okay.
And but even if you don't know how to read poetry, which I think that there's this fear of code that many managers have,
Right.
and this is a personal opinion of mine, that if you're in a technology organization,
Hmm.
you should take the time to learn to understand certain aspects of code, which I don't think actually are very difficult to understand or to comprehend. I think there's a fear of that.
Hmm.
Um, but I think it's worth it, and I think it'll boost the confidence, because ultimately, the thing that they add the most value if they ask the right questions. Like,
Hmm.
it's not about writing code at Gemba. I'm not trying to get them to write code. That's not their job. Their job is to ask the right questions
Okay.
and then facilitate the right conversations and then give context. So you have that. By the way, when two forces who are never joined together are joined together, there's a lot of dysfunctions. So managers have vulnerability, and the teams themselves are like, what is this person doing here? Is this some sort of performance review? Are Again, like when you're bringing these two forces together, there's a lot of trust issues that get
Yeah.
uh, there's a lot of stuff, like a lot of
Yeah.
problems that emerge,
I can probably
and
see
and
a
that
lot of teams not willing to have the managers join, not because they would like to, not doing anything in the sprint, but because of that vulnerability that on the team side, right? Like,
absolutely. I mean, and you know what, that dissipates soon. You're together for 12, I'm sorry, you're together for 2 weeks, for example,
yeah,
right? Depending on how they both act, that awkwardness, it's almost like the first day of school, right? Like you're really
yeah,
awkward and all.
exactly. That's like
Yeah, and that usually it should dissipate, right?
should
If the
dissipate.
managers act in a certain way and the teams act in a certain
Mm,
way, eventually, and a lot of it does come from the managers. Like, for example, you know, if the manager just sits there and is on
mhm.
their laptop or their phone and doesn't really engage, yeah, that's not ideal.
Okay.
And so the preparation to an effective Gemba sprint, like anything else, there's like a prep phase.
Yeah.
And like anything that we do, involves lots of communication. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Um, and there's a lot of guides in the long form article that I sent around, like how do you prep. But yeah, the first one, there's going to be some hiccups in the first couple of days.
Mhm.
You know,
So I would like to highlight two things that you've just said, and maybe you would comment on them too. So one thing you said, you actually invite every manager to learn how to code.
yeah.
It was not a joke, not overstatement. You really believe every manager in a software development company, in a company building software products, need to learn how to code? Or you mean knowing software development, product development life cycles? Like, what do you actually mean by knowing how to code?
It's that's again depends on it depends on what part of a technology organization are they
Hmm.
in. In some cases, they need to understand, container technologies and Docker and things like that. And
Right.
and what I mean by that is understanding enough, whether it's in from one class or two classes, so you
Yeah.
really understand what's happening. You really understand beyond buzzwords, beyond just being able to say, a failed, like you should do TDD, for example. It's
Hmm.
such an easy thing to say,
Yeah.
you know, and even for Scrum masters or coaches, oh, you should do TDD. And well, have you attempted to take a class and just learn using, something simple
Hmm.
as, Java, like just take a simple, multi-hour class that's self-directed, not so that you can then commit code.
Right.
You can really have an appreciation for what these things are,
Yeah.
because absent that, if you have a professional manager, and I have nothing, I believe that good management is key to an organization. I'm not at all, nor, and I think it's quite naive to say you don't need management. I think it's naive, bordering on stupid, for a large organization. I think you very much need effective management,
Hmm.
and we can go into that later. But professional managers that are put in or join a technology organization, they have a mental model that I don't blame them for, which is like, these are resources. Resources. We have to apply patterns from the PMI, or apply
Yeah.
patterns from other areas that, maximize the resource, and have a spreadsheet that says, Ahmad is 25% here and then 25% there. They're trying to maximize the resource as if we're like a printer in a print
Right.
shop, and without actually learning what it is and how fundamentally different the act of research and development is to the act of, you know, painting or printing or that kind of stuff,
Right.
how are you going to effectively manage that organization?
Okay.
But I want to be clear. What I'm not saying is that every manager needs to sit there and code,
Hmm.
you know, and uh,
So are they allowed to observe? Are they allowed to sit like outside and like watch teams coding? Are they allowed to interrupt? And this was basically my topic, my point I would like to highlight too. That you said that you would want them to ask questions. Like, would you expect them to interrupt a team, or would you rather see them, I don't know, being a coach to a team, asking some coaching question, or are these clarification questions for themselves as managers to learn how the work is being done? Like, what kinds of questions and how you ask them?
so let me answer that with an actual story rather than an abstract way.
Yeah.
So a head of product joined the team, and he
Mm-hmm.
joined a very specific team that was asked to. In a trading system, you'll have trade type. Say like, what's the trade type? It's like a drop down box. The drop down box comes, you select the trade type, and so he wanted a new trade type, and the team had said that just adding a new trade type is going to take 3 months minimum. And to him, who grew up with the system, this should be a 20-minute job, because he remembers 20 years ago when the system was born and he wanted
Right.
a trade type. He would say, a developer would go blah blah blah, and then there was a trade type, right? And a new trade type, and or add an enumeration or something like that, or add something to an array, and it was very quick. And now it takes a couple of months, and so he joined that team. No, of course, he's a head of product. He doesn't know what a constructor is, from a construction company. He doesn't know. And so he joins and he's like, I want to understand. So he joins that team that is going to work on
Mm-hmm.
this thing for 3 months. And so, of course, they're opening IDEs and they're doing stuff in the compiling. He doesn't understand, but he's asking questions. And the first thing, he's like, okay, can we just take a step back, go to the whiteboard? And I just want to understand with blocks, like what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And he's brilliant at making them comfortable enough to just
Mm-hmm.
explain the thing, right? Like, why is it taking so long? And
Mm-hmm.
what are you doing right now? And so they started, and he's like, I don't understand, like, what,
Mm-hmm.
because, and eventually I started speaking in English to him. And what emerged in that conversation is what they're doing is there are, and I don't remember,
Mm-hmm.
right? But let's just say between 15 and 25 branches of the code that are running in production.
Ah, okay.
And so what they have to do now, there's active 15 to 25 active versions with different clients. So in order for them to add a trade type, they have to go to each of those branches,
Mm-hmm.
change it. And so they're like, okay, so we're in branch whatever right now, and we're going to try to change this branch, this sprint, test it, and it's going to be all these manual tests. And then he's like, hold on, let me oh, wait, take a step back. How many branches are there? And what does that mean exactly?
Mm-hmm.
They're like, okay, they're like, you think of it this way: there's multiple copies of the code in the wild,
Mm-hmm.
and when you want us to change it, we have to change it in that code, patch it, make sure backward compatibility, make sure that the masters also, all of this kind of stuff. And then it dawns on him: there are how many versions of this code, and what does that actually mean? And this is why this technical debt is why things move so slowly.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the question then comes, like, why did you do this? Why did you do this? And we had a debrief, me and the managers, every night,
Mm-hmm.
where we had like uh, the holy crap count. Like, how many holy craps did you find today?
Yes.
And what I told them is a lot of problems that you're gonna blame the teams can be, if you do a five whys, can be
Like,
directly
to you.
correlated to a
Right.
management decision that you made. And in this particular case, the local management promised a date, and the only way the team can actually deliver is just to
It's
fork
the
the
copy
code,
paste. Yeah, fork the code.
copy and
Right.
paste.
Right. Right.
And this is not their fault. This is your
Right.
fault. like, how come nobody ever told me? All that kind of, when's the last time you've had this conversation with them? And ultimately that resulted in a conversation, a difficult decision.
Mm,
Does he, as head of product, rationalize the code
mm,
and or rewrite or or continue down this path?
mm-hmm.
I don't like. There's no. I don't like. Look, at the end of this Gemba sprint, there's going to be some nice feelings and sticky notes and like. But really, the end's going to be some very difficult decisions you're going to have to make,
Okay.
and and that goes back to them seeing the ground truth.
Mm,
That message going to the head of product is very very difficult because there's going to be a lot of finger pointing
right.
and ass covering on the way to the head of product.
And I like the way you said it in the end that every decision the team is making can be basically reverse engineered or pointed back to the management making the teams do the things they are doing, right?
That's sort of my contention.
Mm,
But I don't want to paint this with a rosy brush either. There were some managers that just sat at their desk and really didn't want to engage.
mm,
You know, we as coaches, when we tell these stories, we tell the highlights.
yeah,
And uh,
sure,
other managers really did not want to engage,
sure,
and they engaged in theater.
yeah,
Pretending to kind of be there and that kind of stuff. And some of the managers really, really engaged and really took it very seriously. Um, a lot of really human and beautiful moments emerged. But this is not to say that sort of magic happened,
mm,
uh, you know, but the mission was accomplished of getting senior leaders and senior managers to spend a whole sprint with the team. And then that gave me confidence that it's doable.